well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our fourth year of sesquicentennial brown bag lunches. And we are going to be doing them throughout the entire calendar year, because even though Robert E. Lee surrendered in April, there's still a lot of other things that are going on throughout the rest of the year. So we will be going at least all the way through December as we continue to focus on the sesquicentennial. I do want to mention, I'll just do it now instead of at the end of the talk, that we do have some flyers in the back for our upcoming symposium, also for upcoming brown bags. And if you didn't hear the announcement last week, the talk with Lawrence Denton on Unionist has been moved. It will not take place at the end of January, but will be at the end of March. So we're going to get started and talk about the marriage of Hetty Cary and John Pegram, or the wedding of Hetty Cary and John Pegram. Now, on January 21st, 1865, this notice appeared in the Richmond Daily Dispatch. And there's nothing that really distinguished this notice from the other two that followed it. It's a fairly basic announcement. But the people who wrote about the wedding shortly after the war had a different take on the wedding and the events that surrounded it. Henry Kidd Douglas, who was a friend of John Pegram's, would recall, "I did not get back to Richmond in time for General Pegram's wedding. He was married on the 19th in St. Paul's Church to Miss Hetty Cary of Baltimore. One of the handsomest and most lovable men I ever knew wed to the handsomest woman in the Southland. With her classic face, her pure complexion, her auburn hair, her perfect figure, and her carriage, altogether the most beautiful woman I ever saw in any land. Ill omens attended the marriage." And Constance Cary, a cousin of the bride, would write in her Recollections Grave and Gay, "On the evening of January 19th, all our little world flocked to St. Paul's Church to see the nuptials of one called by many the most beautiful woman in the South, with a son of Richmond universally honored and beloved. 2 days before, I being confined to my room with a cold, Hetty had come, bringing her bridal veil that I, with our mothers, might be the first to see it tried on her lovely crown of auburn hair. And as she turned from the mirror to salute us with a charming blush and smile, the mirror fell and was broken to small fragments, an accident afterward spoken of by the superstitious as one of a strange series of ominous happenings." Now, before I delve into this strange series of ominous happenings, I want to spend a little time introducing you to the bride and the groom. Now, the bride, as you have heard in the previous two accounts, was beautiful. And Mary Chesnut concurred in that assessment and added that she was clever. She said that her husband James said that if there was no such word as fascinating, you would have to invent one to describe Hetty Cary. Bradley T. Johnston wrote that she was the most beautiful woman of her day and perhaps the most beautiful woman Maryland ever produced. And then a correspondent writing from Baltimore to the New Orleans Crescent provided perhaps the most complete description of Hetty. He said, "Look well at her, for you have never seen and will probably never see again so beautiful a woman. Observe her magnificent form, her rounded arms, her neck and shoulders perfect as if from the sculptor's chisel, her auburn hair, the poise of her well-shaped head. Saw you ever such color on a woman's cheek? And she is not less intelligent than beautiful. She is dressed in pure white. It is worth a king's ransom, a lifetime of trouble to look at one such woman. No wonder Beauregard pronounced her the most beautiful in that city of lovely women." Now, although Hetty's parents could trace their roots to Virginia, she herself was born outside of Baltimore at Haystack, the family farm, born May 15th, 1836. But by the time of the war, the family had actually moved into Baltimore and were living on Utah Street. And the family consisted of Hetty's parents, Wilson Miles Cary, and this is not the best image of him, but it's the only one that I could find. Her mother, Jane Carr Cary, and her younger siblings, Jane Margaret, or Jenny, and Wilson Miles Jr. Hetty's mother operated a girls' school, and her father worked as a notary public. And the younger Carys were immediately swept up by this wave of war fever. 25-year-old Hetty led a group of women who called themselves the Monument Street Girls, or more flamboyantly, La Garde de la Pomme d'Or. And they sewed uniforms and made flags for the Maryland Boys in Gray, and then smuggled these through the lines. Jenny, being of a musical bent, took James Ryder Randall's poem Maryland and adapted it to music, adding the word my, and it's to the tune of O Tannenbaum, which was also kind of a college song, a tune for a college song as well. And at one of their meetings, these girls and their members of the Garde de la Pomme d'Or sang so loudly that passers-by on the streets below could hear it. That did not bother these girls, though. In fact, on one occasion, Hetty intentionally waved a Confederate banner out the window as Union troops marched by. But it was becoming more and more difficult to live in Baltimore because of their activities. There were a few threats of arrest in the air, and young Wilson Miles really wanted to join the Confederate Army. So these young people decided that they would leave town, and under cover of darkness, with the oars of a rowboat muffled, they crossed the Potomac right in gunshot of the U.S. man-of-war Pawnee. And on this trip, Hetty carried with her a flag that had been specially made for the Maryland troops. It had Maryland's state seal painted on it. They made it safely and arrived in Richmond in July of 1861. They got here a little bit before, about a week before the Battle of Manassas, or Bull Run. Now, they had known Lee from some time that he spent in Baltimore, so they were invited by Robert E. Lee to dine at the Spotswood Hotel, and there at the Spotswood, Lee introduced them to Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president. Then the girls were off to, in September, at the invitation of General P.G.T. Beauregard, they were off to Manassas to visit the Maryland troops there, and they met up with their cousin, Constance Cary. And these three young ladies visited the troops amid all sorts of fanfare and fun, and they called themselves the Cary Invincibles, and this is a name they gave to themselves, kind of a little bit of pseudo-military type club. I should mention that the picture of Jenny in the middle is disputed. It's not known for certain that is she, so there's a little bit of debate over that image. But these three young ladies were also chosen to make some of the first Confederate battle flags. On the field of battle at Manassas, there had been a great deal of confusion between the U.S. flag and the Confederate States flag. And even though there are differences in the middle of a battle with smoke and gunpowder and dust, it would be difficult. So General Beauregard had designed a new flag that was adopted by the War Department with a few modifications, adopted on October 1st, 1861. And these three young ladies made flags for various commanding generals. Hetty's flag went to General Joseph Johnston, and we have moved her flag down here. It's at the back of the room. Jenny's flag, which we do not have in our collection, went to General Beauregard, and then Constance's flag went to General Earl Van Doren. And this happens to be my favorite flag in the collection. And the reason is, and it's really hard to see on this slide, but Constance actually embroidered her name there. And this flag we have just recently had conserved. It's going to be unveiled today following this talk. So you'll get a chance to look at that flag, newly restored in all its glory. Now, while Hetty was riding this wave of adulation, the war had not been so kind to John Pegram. He had met with defeat at Rich Mountain and was being held as a prisoner of war. But I want to give you a little bit of John Pegram's background. Pegram was born in Petersburg, January 24th, 1832. His father, James West Pegram, was a brigadier general in the state militia and was an attorney. And his mother, Virginia, was the daughter of Colonel William Ransom Johnson, who was a successful horse breeder in Chesterfield County and owned Oakland Plantation. But John spent his formative years in Richmond because his father was made president of the Bank of Virginia. So he moved the family to Richmond. They moved into a house at the corner of West and Franklin Street. James Pegram became very active in the Richmond community. He served on the city council and became a member of Monumental Church, and then later helped to found St. Paul's Church. However, a bizarre accident altered the family's fortunes. On October 23rd, 1844, the boilers of the Lucy Walker exploded. This was a steamship that was making its way down the Ohio River. There were 111 people on board. James Pegram was one of those. He was traveling for business. And of those on board, 56 died. And one of those was James Pegram. Now, this left Virginia as a widow with 5 children to support. John, who was the second eldest, was only 12 years old at the time. But Virginia was a resourceful woman. She moved the family into a house 106 to 108 Franklin Street in Linden Row. And today this is known as the Linden Row Inn. In fact, one of the rooms is named Mrs. Pegram's Parlor. But there she opened a school for young women and was able to support herself and her family. And then with the help of John's uncle, George H. Pegram, who was a West Point graduate and had served as an aide to Winfield Scott in the Mexican War, she was able to secure for John an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. And John was a member of the graduating class of 1854. At graduation, he ranked 10 in a class of 46 and was appointed a brevet second lieutenant. And a couple of his classmates were Oliver O. Howard and Jeb Stuart. And this is a photograph in our collection, a very young Jeb Stuart there in all his glory. This is back in the day when he was known as Beauty. But Jeb Stuart wrote that I have an intimate friend in the Corps named John Pegram of Richmond, who is decidedly the best-hearted fellow I ever knew. Now, Pegram, after graduation, spent time at forts in California, also in the territories of Kansas, South Dakota, and Nebraska. And then he returned in 1855 to West Point to teach cavalry tactics there. And then in 1859, he was off to Europe to observe the Italian War, or the Franco-Austrian War. And he arrived back in the States in April of 1860, just as things were heating up here. Actually, yeah. And ended up being stationed in Taos, New Mexico, which was a territory at the time. And I'm always very happy when I find somebody who spent time in New Mexico, being a New Mexico native. So I was thrilled to discover this about John Pegram. But he did spend time in Taos, and he was actually in Taos when he heard about South Carolina's secession. And unlike many others, it didn't take him any time to decide. He automatically submitted a letter of resignation. He did this maybe a little too quickly, because on January 23rd, he withdrew that resignation, probably because Virginia had not yet seceded and decided to go with the Confederacy. So John thought better, decided to hold off a little bit. Then a month later, he was transferred to Santa Fe, And during that time, he actually did offer his sword to Virginia in the event of war. And by doing this, he was the first federal officer to make, or serving officer to make that commitment. Now, on May 10th, Pegram officially resigned from the U.S. Army, but by that time, he had acquired leave, he had traveled to Montgomery, Alabama, he had accepted an appointment as first lieutenant in the Confederate Corps of Artillery, and then was very quickly nominated by Virginia's governor to the post of lieutenant colonel. And then when Virginia became part of the Confederacy, he was transferred over to Confederate service. Now, in June, Pegram was ordered to Western Virginia as lieutenant colonel of the 20th Virginia. And these troops were under the command of General Robert S. Garnett. And there in Western Virginia, Garnett planned to defend 2 mountain passes that served as a gateway to the northeast. He established his base at Laurel Ridge and sent the remainder of the troops over here to Rich Mountain under Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Heck. And Pegram's troops were ordered to go along with Heck's. Pegram ended up being in the process of serving on a board of inquiry, so he actually arrived later. He arrived after his troops got there, and the first thing that this 29-year-old lieutenant colonel did was demand that command of the camp be turned over to him. Now, technically, he was correct. He held his commission in the Confederacy. Heck was only in Virginia service at that time, but the way Pegram went about doing this ruffled the feathers of many of the men and officers. It didn't set so well. And then he made matters worse when he failed to heed some intelligence reports, and a Union attack came from a direction for which he was not prepared. So the camp was overrun. Heck and other officers felt like the men had a chance of escaping, but Pegram insisted on surrender. And this is one of those difficult decisions that Pegram really couldn't live down. It would haunt him throughout the rest of the war because his men were the only ones that failed to escape. But as a prisoner of war, John Pegram was sent to Fort McHenry in Baltimore. Also, he spent some time at Fort Columbus in New York and Fort Warren in Boston Harbor before being released on parole. And when he was paroled, he went to Richmond. Now, while he was in Baltimore, he did meet Hetty's parents, and interestingly enough, he acquired from them a letter of introduction. So when he came to Richmond, he met Hetty. Now, there's not an account of their first meeting, so we don't know where they first met or exactly under what circumstances, but they automatically almost became a couple and certainly enjoyed social life in the city. After he was paroled, Pegram was promoted to a full colonel. He was sent out to Mississippi because General Beauregard had requested an engineer, so Lee sent Pegram. Then he ended up in the Army of Tennessee, serving as a staff officer under General Braxton Bragg and then under General Kirby Smith. And evidently, as he traveled, he carried a miniature of Hetty Cary with him. This is a description from one of the soldiers under Pegram, describing, he said, "He was amiable and kindly as the gentlest woman. He was scarcely handsome, but neat and fresh as a new leaf on a spring morning, and all the dust of camp work with just the dandiest little touch of dandyism. Frank, open-faced, winning manner, natural and graceful in every moment. No man's or woman's eyes rested on Pegram without an emotion of pleasure." Now, on November 10th, 1862, John Pegram was given command of a cavalry brigade and made a brigadier general. And this caused Mary Chesnut to somewhat sarcastically say, General Pegram is promoted regularly after every one of his defeats. And perhaps a little bit too harsh. He would never suffer a humiliation on the scale of Rich Mountain, but his service in the Army of Tennessee was fairly lackluster. There was also a lot of infighting within the Army of Tennessee, so it wasn't the most pleasant time. Now, in 1863, though, in August, Pegram was ordered to report to the Army of Northern Virginia. And it's not exactly known why the transfer occurred. It could have been because of the harsh feelings in the Army of Tennessee and the thought that a Virginian would do much better in an army of Virginians. It also could be because his younger brother William was a successful artillerist in Lee's army, and he perhaps may have used his influence. But whatever the case, it was certain that Pegram was pleased to return to Virginia and, of course, to Hetty Cary. Pegram's time in the Army of Virginia was good. He was given command of an infantry brigade in Jubal Early's division of Richard Ewell's 2nd Corps, and eventually rose to command a division. And of course, being close to Richmond, he had opportunity to spend time here when the Army was in winter quarters. He was wounded in the Battle of the Wilderness. He was hit in the leg by a bullet, but that only meant that he got to come to Richmond and recuperate under Hetty's watchful eye. And then toward the end of the war, when the Army was encamped in trenches down at Petersburg, he and Willie got to spend a lot of time in long conversations. And we have in our collection a letter that Willie Pegram wrote to their mother. And I think this shows the close relationship between the brothers and also the relationship that they had with their mother. He says, "Tell Miss Hetty that I sent her little general to her by talking about her and describing her ugliness until he was almost mad. How I wish that they could be married." Well, Willie got his wish, and I'm sure it was John's too. During the Christmas season of 1864, Hetty's mother secured a pass that allowed her to come from Baltimore to Richmond, and John immediately asked for Hetty's hand, and the preparations for the wedding began in earnest. And one thing that John did on January 16 was to write to Robert E. Lee's Adjutant General, Walter Taylor, asking for 4 days leave to come to Richmond on urgent business. And it's interesting to think that in a few months, Walter Taylor would be asking a very similar favor of Lee. But the wedding date was set for January 19th at 8 p.m., and the ceremony took place at St. Paul's, which of course is the church that John's father had helped to establish. All of Richmond society turned out for this wedding. It's kind of one of the big events, and certainly was a bright moment amid the gloom of war. However, as I mentioned at the beginning, there were some ill omens that accompanied the event. And the first of those was the shattering of that looking glass as Hetty displayed her veil. The remaining two events or occurrences took place on the actual day of the wedding. Verena Davis had sent the president's carriage so that the carriage could transport Hetty to the wedding. But when she got in, the horses reared and balked and refused to move, and they had to rush around, find another means of transportation. She and John ended up riding together to the church in an old hack. And as a result of this, they arrived late for their own wedding. And then as they were coming in, Hetty dropped her handkerchief, and she stooped down to pick it up because no one noticed this. She tore her veil. Nevertheless, as she walked down the aisle, there was this murmur of awe. And Constance wrote, "Her complexion was pearly white, the vivid roses of her cheeks and lips, the sheen of her radiant hair, and the happy gleam of her beautiful brown eyes seemed to defy all sorrow, change, or fear." And it was the bride's brother, Captain Wilson Miles Cary, who gave her away. The rector of St. Paul's, Dr. Charles Minigerode, conducted the ceremony. And then following the service, there was a reception held at the home of Colonel and Mrs. Thomas Peyton on Main between 2nd and 3rd Streets. And the Peytons were the friends with whom Mrs. Cary was staying. And even some who were unable to attend this ceremony relayed their congratulations. And this was sent by Fitzhugh Lee. Time 8 p.m., goodbye, Miss Hetty Cary. Interval time 9 p.m., good evening, Mrs. J. Pegram. The last friend to bid you goodbye, the first friend to wish you a good evening, with a heart too full for further utterance. Now, tragically, and I quote Constance Cary here, 3 weeks later to the day, General Pegram's coffin, crossed with a victor's palms beside his soldier's accoutrement, occupied the spot in the chancel where he had stood to be married. Beside it knelt his widow, swathed in crape. Again, Dr. Minigerode conducted the ceremony. Again, the church was full. Behind the hearse, waiting outside, stood his war charger with boots and stirrups. The wailing of the band that went with us on the slow pilgrimage to Hollywood will never die out of memory. Now, the time that the couple had together was brief. They moved into a farmhouse near Hatcher's Run, about 9 miles from Petersburg. This was located near Pegram's troops. And the new bride took delight in fixing up the rooms and even in acquiring a waffle recipe from John's mother. On February 2nd, General John B. Gordon, who was in command of the 2nd Corps, gave Hetty the honor of reviewing the troops in her husband's division. But shortly after this, the Union renewed their offensive. Grant's objective was to cut off Lee's supply route and to cut off the Boyd and Plank Road here, and then also the South Side Railroad. And this was the last rail line going into Petersburg, so it was definitely vital. Skirmishing occurred near Hatcher's Run on February 5th. John Pegram was not involved in that day's skirmish. But that evening, as he was on his way to General Gordon's headquarters for a meeting, riding along, he met John Easton Cook, who was a classmate and a friend of his. And Cook later wrote about this encounter with Pegram. He said that as they rode, they talked of old times and, quote, old familiar faces. And Cook would later recall that there was a strange sort of melancholy, a peculiar sadness about Pegram that night. And at headquarters, when General Pegram predicted that the attack would come on Pegram's part of the line, or when Gordon predicted the attack would come on Pegram's part of the line, Cook wrote that his countenance and attitude exhibited unmistakable depression and languor. He said, it was impossible for him to banish from his mind the fancy that something conveyed to the young soldier a premonition of the coming event. And the attack did happen just as General Gordon had predicted. On February 6th, as Pegram rode with his men, they encountered Union forces near Hatcher's Run. And the fighting was fiercest around a mill called Dabney's Mill. And that is where John Pegram issued his last command before leading his men, along with some men from General William Mahone's division, in a charge. Pegram was shot through the heart and died almost instantaneously. And it can be noted that he died in this snowy field outside Petersburg, not too far from where he had been born. Now, Hetty was completely unaware of her husband's peril. She had spent the day with her mother in Petersburg carting lint. Captain Gordon McCabe, who was a close friend of General Pegram, wrote Constance Cary describing what happened next. He said, "I can tell you of the tragic time after he was killed, when our guns pulled past the ambulance where she was carting lint, and I heard her laughing merrily within. I knew he was dead, shot at the head of his division, while she sat there waiting for him to come to her. After his body had been tenderly placed in the room used as an adjutant general's office at headquarters, word was sent to her that she might safely return to their quarters and go to bed, for it would be late before he could get back. And then Constance Cary went on to explain, so she slept peacefully that night in a room above his body, a bride of 3 weeks. In the morning, an old gentleman, a civilian, volunteered to go up and call her down to where Pegram lay. Kneeling beside the body, she put her hand into the breast of his coat, drawing out first his watch, still ticking, that she had wound for him just before they parted. Next, a miniature of herself, both stained with lifeblood. My aunt and her son accompanied the widow to Richmond in a freight car, she sitting beside the coffin. No one of us is likely to forget the sad days that followed. She was like a flower broken in the stalk. And then a second blow struck the family not even 2 months later when Willie was killed at Five Forks on April 1st. And Hetty, during this time of mourning, dutifully stayed with the family, and then she returned to her home, her original home in Baltimore. And there, for the next 15 years, she operated the Southern Home School, which was a school for girls. And then in 1879, she met and married Dr. Henry Newell Martin. And I speculate that Hetty must have retained her beauty, because at the time of the wedding, she was 43 and he was only 31, so he was 12 years her junior. And Martin was an esteemed biologist. In fact, he held the first chair of biology at Johns Hopkins. The couple was known for holding informal evening conferences in their home with Martin's students. But unfortunately, her last years probably were not all that happy. Martin was an alcoholic, and as a result of that, his health suffered. Hetty passed away on September 27th, 1892, at the age of 56, and then Martin followed her in death a year later. Now, as I was looking for images, I happened to find this online. This is a book that was published, written by Dr. Martin, and you'll notice that it says, and Hetty Cary Martin. This published in the year of her death. And perhaps that demonstrates the kind of helpmeet she was to him. Now, Hetty is buried in Baltimore County at St. Thomas's Episcopal Church Cemetery. And there's a shot of her tomb. The inscription reads, "Beautiful, brilliant, brave, of pure and noble heart, true and generous soul, in the battle of life heroic, in death triumphant." And on that somewhat dreary note, I'll conclude.